At 9:47 a.m. on March 18, 1945, Private First Class Danny Reeves crouched in a foxhole 200 yards from German lines near the Ruhr River, watching 3 enemy snipers pin down his entire company. 47 men trapped, no artillery support, no air cover, just open ground and 3 Mauser rifles that had already killed 6 Americans that morning. In the next 8 minutes, Reeves would use a technique so dangerous and unorthodox that his commanding officer would threaten him with court-martial, right before requesting he teach it to every combat engineer in 3rd Army. The coal mines of Scranton, Pennsylvania, don't teach you much about military doctrine, but they teach you about pressure, about thinking fast when the ceiling's coming down, about doing what works instead of what the manual says. Danny Reeves learned those lessons at 14, following his father into the anthracite darkness every morning before school. By 16, he could set blasting charges with his eyes closed, calculating powder weight and fuse length by feel. The mine foreman called him reckless. His father called him efficient. The difference was Danny understood that sometimes you had to break the rules to keep men alive. He enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, turned 18 in basic training at Fort Belvoir. The Army looked at his mining background and made him a combat engineer. Seemed logical enough. Except Army doctrine for mine warfare had been written by men who'd never crawled through a collapsed shaft with 60 seconds of oxygen left. The manual said mines were defensive weapons. Plant them in fields, mark them on maps, create barriers, wait for the enemy to walk into them. Danny saw men die following that doctrine. February 12, 1945. Sergeant Mike Brennan led a squad to lay a minefield outside Düren. Textbook placement, proper spacing, everything by regulation. German mortars opened up while they worked. Brennan took shrapnel through the chest. Died in the mud, with a mine still in his hands, the field half finished and useless. February 23rd. Corporal Jimmy Hayes tried to clear a path through German mines for advancing infantry. Standard procedure. Probe with a bayonet. Mark each mine. Remove them one by one. A hidden teller mine detonated under his knee. The medics found pieces of him across 40 feet of frozen ground. March 3rd. Private First Class. Tommy Sullivan got orders to plant anti-personnel mines along a tree line. He argued with Lieutenant Mackey, said the Germans would just go around it, that they needed something mobile, something aggressive. Mackey told him to follow doctrine or face charges. Sullivan planted the mines. Germans bypassed them 6 hours later and overran the position. Sullivan took 3 rounds in the back, trying to retreat. Danny knew Tommy. They'd bunked next to each other since Normandy. Tommy showed him photographs of his kid sister every damn night. Talked about opening a garage together after the war, fixing Fords and Chevrolets in some quiet Pennsylvania town. After Sullivan's death, Danny stopped sleeping much. He started watching the German positions differently, not through a tactical lens, but through a miner's lens, studying angles, calculating risks, seeing opportunities where doctrine saw nothing. The problem was simple. American mine tactics were static. Plant them and pray the enemy walks into them. But the Germans were smart, experienced. They spotted minefield patterns. They went around. They sent out probe teams. They adapted faster than American doctrine could. Danny saw a different solution. Mines didn't have to be defensive. They could be offensive, aggressive, mobile. But saying that out loud would get you laughed at, or worse. He tried once, after Sullivan's death. Captain Rhodes was inspecting their position, and Danny approached him carefully, respectfully. Explained that mines could be deployed during active combat, used to target specific enemy positions, delivered in ways the Germans wouldn't expect. Rhodes looked at him like he'd suggested surrendering. "Private, mines are defensive implements. We plant them according to field manual specifications. If you have concerns about tactical deployment, take them up with someone who cares about your opinion." Dismissed. That was the end of that conversation. But Danny couldn't let it go. Every patrol, every advance, he saw situations where a well-placed mine could break an enemy position faster than an entire artillery barrage. Bunkers that were impossible to flank. Machine gun nests protected by interlocking fire. Sniper positions too distant for grenades, but too close for mortar teams to risk. The regulations said mines were placement tools, defensive instruments. You dug them in, marked the map, and forgot about them until somebody stepped wrong. Danny knew there was another way, a dangerous way, an unorthodox way, a way that would probably get him court-martialed. But after watching Tommy Sullivan die for following the rules, Danny had stopped caring much about regulations. The problem was figuring out how to do it without getting killed in the process. He started experimenting in quiet moments. Not with live charges, he wasn't suicidal, but with weights and distances, testing theories in his head, working through the physics. How much weight could you throw accurately? What kind of spin would keep it stable? How would you time the fuse? The M1 anti-tank mine weighed 20 pounds, too heavy for any kind of distance throw. But the shoe mine, the German shoe mine the engineers had started carrying as captured equipment, that was different. Just 4 pounds, small, compact, powerful enough to blow a leg off or collapse a bunker entrance. And if you modified the fuse just right, if you shortened it to burn fast but not too fast, if you could throw it hard enough and straight enough. Danny thought about it constantly, worked through the angles while digging foxholes, calculated trajectories while cleaning his rifle, imagined the spin while lying awake in dark barracks. He knew it could work. He also knew it was absolutely forbidden. March the 17th, 1945. Night fell cold over the Ruhr pocket. The company had pushed to within 300 yards of the river, but German resistance was stiffening. Sniper fire had been picking off anyone who moved during daylight. Artillery was conserving shells for the main assault. They were stuck. Danny sat in a shallow fighting position, cleaning his M1 carbine, listening to Lieutenant Mackey brief squad leaders 20 feet away. 3 confirmed sniper positions, Mackey said quietly. 2 in the farmhouse at 200 yards, 1 in the church bell tower. They've got clear sight lines across our entire front. We advance tomorrow at dawn regardless. Division's orders. One of the sergeants spoke up. "That's a goddamn death sentence, sir. We'll lose half the company crossing that open ground." "I'm aware of that, Sergeant. But unless you can drop artillery on those positions without bringing down the entire German line on top of us, we don't have options." Danny listened. Thought about Tommy Sullivan. Thought about the shoe mines in the supply depot. Thought about angles and fuses and rotation. He stood up. "Sir, I might have an option." Mackey turned, irritated. "Reeves, unless you've developed the ability to fly, sit back down. I can take out those positions, the snipers, tonight." The silence that followed was cold. "Explain yourself, Private," Danny explained. "Not all of it. Not the part about modifying fuses or the physics he'd been calculating for weeks. Just enough to make Mackey understand the basic concept. Use captured German mines, modified deployment, close approach under darkness. Eliminate the positions before dawn. Mackey stared at him for 10 long seconds. That's the single most reckless thing I've ever heard. Yes, sir. You'll be killed in the attempt. Maybe, sir. And if you somehow survive, I'll have you court-martialed for destroying military property and violating engagement protocols. Understood, sir. Another silence. Then Mackey did something Danny didn't expect. He smiled. Just slightly. You have until 0400 hours, Reeves. If those positions aren't neutralized by dawn, you better hope the Germans kill you before I do. At 11:15 p.m., Danny moved through the supply depot alone. The captured German equipment sat in wooden crates near the back, poorly organized and mostly forgotten. He found what he needed quickly. 4 shoe mines, intact and functional. He checked the fuses carefully, examining the powder trains, measuring the burn rates by texture and smell. Standard fuse, 8 seconds from ignition to detonation. Too long for what he had planned. The mine would hit the ground before it exploded, might roll away, might bury itself in mud, and waste the charge. He needed 3 seconds, maybe 4. Just enough time to throw hard, watch it arc, let it detonate on impact or just before. Danny pulled out his wire cutters. The regulations were explicit. Never tamper with explosives. Never modify fuses. Never adjust detonation mechanisms outside of authorized engineering facilities with proper supervision. He thought about Tommy Sullivan again. About the photographs of his kid's sister. About dying because you followed the rules. Danny cut the fuse. The work was delicate. One wrong move, and the mine would detonate in his hands. But his fingers remembered coal mine demolition charges, remembered setting blasting caps in darkness with water rising around his boots. He shortened the fuse precisely, measuring by feel, crimping the igniter tight. 3 seconds. He tested the weight, the balance. Felt right. He modified all 4 mines the same way. Took 20 minutes. His hands were steady the entire time, covered in powder residue and grease. When he finished, he wrapped each mine carefully in cloth, placed them in his pack, and walked back to his position. Nobody saw him. Nobody asked questions. At 2:30 a.m., Danny crawled forward alone. The German positions were quiet. Occasional movement in the farmhouse windows. Nothing from the church tower. They weren't expecting an attack during darkness. Why would they? Americans didn't operate like that. The ground was soft from recent rain. Every movement made noise. Cloth against grass, equipment shifting, his breathing loud in his own ears. He moved slowly, painfully slowly, using every ditch and shell crater for cover. The air smelled like wet soil and distant smoke. It took 40 minutes to cover 150 yards. His knees ached. His hands were numb. But he reached a collapsed stone wall 50 yards from the farmhouse and stopped, catching his breath, studying the target. 2 windows, 2nd floor. Sniper positions facing the American lines. He couldn't see them clearly, but he could see the rifle barrels occasionally catching moonlight. Danny pulled the first mine from his pack, unwrapped it carefully, found the igniter cord. His heart hammered. Not from fear, from anticipation. This was either going to work spectacularly or kill him spectacularly. Either way, it would be spectacular. He struck the igniter against a rough stone. It sparked, caught, started burning. 3 seconds. Danny stood, arm cocked back like a pitcher on a mound. 20 pounds of muscle memory from a childhood throwing rocks at rats in mine shafts. He focused on the window, calculated the arc, adjusted for wind. He threw. The mine spun through the darkness, a dark shape against darker sky. For one terrible moment, Danny thought he'd miscalculated, that it would fall short or go wide. Then it disappeared through the second-floor window. 2 seconds later, the explosion lit up the night. The blast was massive, louder than he'd expected, brighter, more violent. The entire upper floor of the farmhouse erupted outward. Wooden beams splintered, stone cracked. Fire bloomed from both windows simultaneously. Germans, voices shouted, someone screamed. Danny was already moving, pulling the second mine from his pack, igniting the fuse, targeting the adjacent window where he'd seen the second rifle. He threw again. This one was perfect. Sailed through the window like a fastball, detonated inside the room. The second explosion finished what the first had started. The roof collapsed inward. Flames spread fast through the old timber. Nobody was shooting from the farmhouse anymore. Danny turned toward the church. The bell tower was 180 yards away, too far for an accurate throw. But the sniper up there had heard the explosions, would be looking toward the farmhouse, trying to understand what happened. Danny ran, not toward the church, toward a drainage ditch that angled closer, that would give him 60 yards of covered approach. His boots splashed through standing water. His breathing came hard. Behind him, German soldiers were shouting, organizing, trying to respond to the farmhouse explosions. He reached the ditch end, 90 yards from the church now, still too far. He crawled forward through open ground, exposed, vulnerable. If the sniper looked down, if anyone spotted him, he was dead. But everyone was looking at the farmhouse, at the fire, at the chaos. Danny reached a burned-out tractor 70 yards from the church. Close enough. He pulled the third mine, lit the fuse. The church bell tower was a tall target, narrow. The window openings were small. This throw would be harder than the farmhouse. Higher arc, more spin, longer flight time. Danny had thrown rocks at birds as a kid. Never hit many. But he'd learned the technique. He threw upward. Maximum force. Perfect release. The mine tumbled through the air. For 3 seconds that felt like 30, Danny watched it rise, arc, fall. It went through the bell tower opening. The explosion blew out all 4 sides of the tower simultaneously. The bell itself rang once, a broken sound, then crashed down through the church roof. Flames erupted from the opening. The sniper never fired again. Danny stood there, breathing hard, watching the fire spread. 3 positions, 3 throws, 3 successes. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He spun, reaching for his carbine, expecting German soldiers. It was Lieutenant Mackey and Captain Rhodes and 4 other soldiers from the company, all of them staring at the burning buildings with expressions somewhere between shock and awe. Mackey spoke first. "Reeves, what in the actual hell did you just do?" Danny looked at the fires, at the destroyed positions, at the dawn starting to break over the Ruhr. "My job, sir. Remove the obstacles." Rhodes stepped forward. His face was unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "Sergeant Williams, make a note. Private Reeves is to report to battalion headquarters at 0700. We need to discuss his methodology." Danny's stomach dropped. Here it came. The court-martial, the charges, the punishment for breaking every rule. But Mackey was grinning. Actually grinning. Begging the captain's pardon, sir, but I think what Private Reeves needs is a medal and a teaching assignment. Rhodes looked at Mackey, then at the fires, then at Danny. We'll discuss that at headquarters. Dismissed. At 9:47 a.m., exactly as planned, the company advanced across the open ground toward the Ruhr River. Not a single shot was fired from the German positions. The snipers were dead. The positions were ash. 47 men crossed safely. 0 casualties. Danny walked with them, his mind already racing ahead to the meeting at headquarters, to whatever consequences were waiting. He thought about Tommy Sullivan, about the garage they'd never opened together, about photographs of a kid sister Danny would never meet. He'd broken the rules, violated doctrine, risked court-martial, and he'd kept 47 men alive. That felt like a fair trade. At 7 a.m., Danny stood outside the battalion headquarters tent, waiting. His uniform was still muddy from the night patrol. His hands still smelled like explosive residue. He'd cleaned up as best he could, but there was only so much you could do with cold water and a rag. Inside the tent, he could hear voices. Rhodes, Mackey, someone else he didn't recognize. The conversation was muffled, but the tone was heated. Finally, a sergeant emerged and gestured him inside. The tent was cramped, lit by a single kerosene lamp despite the morning light. Captain Rhodes sat behind a folding table covered in maps and reports. Lieutenant Mackay stood to one side, and beside him was a major Danny had never seen before, older, with combat infantry badges and a Purple Heart ribbon. "Private Reeves," Rhodes said formally. "This is Major Hendricks, 3rd Army Combat Engineering Division." Danny saluted. Hendricks returned it casually. "At ease, son. I've been hearing some interesting things about your activities last night." Hendricks picked up a piece of paper from the table. "Lieutenant Mackey's report is quite detailed. 3 enemy positions neutralized. 0 friendly casualties. Method of engagement: modified German shoe mines, deployed via manual throw with shortened fuses." Hendricks looked up. "That about accurate?" "Yes, sir." "You realize that tampering with explosive devices is a court-martial offense?" "Yes, sir." "You realize that unauthorized use of captured enemy equipment violates multiple Army regulations?" "Yes, sir." "You realize that conducting an unsanctioned night assault without proper authorization could be classified as abandoning your position?" "Sir, Lieutenant Mackey authorized you to neutralize the positions. He did not authorize you to modify explosives, violate safety protocols, or invent entirely new combat techniques that appear nowhere in any field manual written since 1918. Danny said nothing. This was going exactly as he'd expected. Rhodes spoke up. "Major, if I may. Private Reeves saved 47 men yesterday. His methods were unorthodox, but the results speak for themselves. Captain, I'm not disputing the results. I'm questioning whether we want to encourage this kind of reckless innovation. What happens when some other private decides to modify explosives and blows himself up? What happens when someone tries this technique without Reeves's apparent skill and kills friendly forces?" Mackey cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, we've been using the same mine warfare doctrine since the Great War. Static deployment, defensive positioning, predictable patterns. The Germans have figured us out. They avoid our minefields. They bypass our defensive positions. Maybe we need some reckless innovation." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. He looked at Danny again, studying him. "Where'd you learn to throw like that, son?" "Scranton coal mines, sir. Used to throw rocks at rats. And I played some baseball in high school. And the explosive modification? Where'd you learn that? Same place, sir. Setting demolition charges in mine shafts. You learn to calculate fuse times pretty carefully when the ceiling's about to come down on your head. Hendricks nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Gentlemen, I'm going to make a decision that will probably get me reprimanded by Division Command. He looked at Rhodes. Captain, you're not going to court-martial Private Reeves. You're going to recommend him for promotion to corporal and assign him to training duties. Rhodes blinked. Sir? We're losing this war on innovation, Captain. The Germans have better tactics, better coordination, better adaptation. We're following doctrine written when nobody had ever seen a tank or a combat aircraft. If we want to win, we need men who think like Reeves here, men who see problems and solve them, instead of waiting for some staff officer in Paris to update the manual. He turned to Danny. Here's what's going to happen, Corporal Reeves. You're going to spend the next 2 weeks teaching your technique to every combat engineer in 3rd Army. You're going to demonstrate it. You're going to train them on fuse modification, throwing technique, target selection, and you're going to document everything so we can write it into official doctrine. Danny felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. Sir, I'm not a teacher. You're a coal miner who figured out how to kill 3 enemy snipers with captured mines and a good throwing arm. That makes you more qualified than half the instructors at Fort Belvoir. Hendricks stood. This is not optional, Corporal. You have 2 hours to write up everything you know about this technique. Lieutenant Mackey will assist. We're running the first training session tomorrow at Uro 900. Yes, sir. Hendricks headed for the tent exit, then paused. One more thing, Reeves. Don't ever modify explosives without proper authorization again. If you have ideas about new techniques, you bring them to Lieutenant Mackey. First, if you freelance like this again, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of the war cleaning latrines in Casablanca. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. Hendricks left. Rhodes looked at Danny with an expression that was equal parts annoyance and grudging respect. Dismissed, Corporal. Get that training document written. Danny saluted and walked out into the morning sunlight, his head spinning. 2 weeks became 4. 4 weeks became 6. Danny stood in front of groups of combat engineers, demonstrating the throw technique on a makeshift range, explaining fuse modification with careful precision, teaching target selection, approach tactics, safety protocols. The men were skeptical at first. This wasn't how mines worked. This wasn't doctrine. Then Danny would demonstrate. Light the fuse, throw 70 yards, hit a target window, watch it explode. The skepticism evaporated fast. By April, 23 combat engineers had mastered the technique well enough to deploy it in combat. By May, 48. The word spread through informal channels. Engineer to engineer, company to company. Men who'd watched friends die to enemy positions they couldn't reach suddenly had a new tool. April 9th. Corporal James Donnelly used the technique to neutralize a German machine gun nest that had pinned down 2 infantry companies near Kassel. 3 throws, 3 hits, 36 men crossed safely, April 23rd. Sergeant Paul Martinez destroyed a fortified observation post that had been directing artillery fire on American positions. 2 throws, direct hits. Artillery coordination collapsed. May 2nd. Private Eddie Russo took out a sniper position in a bombed-out factory that had killed 11 men over 3 days. 1 throw, perfect accuracy. The sniper never fired again. The reports kept coming. Success after success. Lives saved. Positions neutralized. And the Germans noticed. May 7th. Intelligence intercepted a German radio transmission from a Wehrmacht unit near Leipzig. The translation was rough but clear. Americans deploying explosives with unusual delivery method. Appears to be hand-thrown mines with impact detonation. Advise caution when occupying elevated defensive positions. May 14th. A captured German lieutenant was interrogated about tactical changes. He mentioned that his unit had been ordered to avoid stationary positions with window access after multiple instances of American mine infiltration attacks. The technique was working, not just tactically, but psychologically. The Germans were adapting their doctrine because of something Danny Reeves had invented in a foxhole with a handful of captured mines and a childhood spent throwing rocks. But official recognition was slower to come. The engineering division wrote reports, tactical analysis documents, training manuals. They called it mobile mine deployment technique in the paperwork, dry, bureaucratic language that stripped away the desperation and innovation that had created it. Danny's name appeared in exactly one paragraph of one report, buried in an appendix. Initial development of technique attributed to Corporal Daniel Reeves, 23rd Combat Engineer Battalion, March 1945. No medal, no commendation, just a footnote. Danny didn't care. He'd stopped caring about recognition somewhere around the time Tommy Sullivan died, following the rules. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Danny stood in a dusty French town square with the rest of his battalion, listening to the announcement over a crackling radio, watching men celebrate and cry and get drunk on liberated cognac. He thought about Tommy Sullivan, about the garage they'd never open, about all the men who'd lived, because Danny had decided to break the rules one night near the Ruhr River. The celebration felt hollow somehow. Victory was good, peace was good, but it didn't bring anyone back. In June, the demobilization started. Points system, length of service, time in combat. Danny had enough points to go home by July. Before he left, Major Hendricks found him one last time. Heading back to Pennsylvania? Yes, sir, Scranton. Got a job waiting at the mine. You ever think about staying in? Army could use more men like you. Men who think different. Danny shook his head. I've done my part, sir. Time to go home. Hendricks handed him an envelope. Your discharge papers, and something else. Inside was a single-page letter on 3rd Army letterhead. Official commendation for innovative tactical development. Doesn't come with a medal, but it's in your service record. Might help if you ever need to prove you were more than just a coal miner with a good throwing arm. Danny read it once, folded it carefully, put it in his pack. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Corporal. You saved a lot of lives. That matters more than any medal. They shook hands. Danny walked away, heading toward the transport trucks that would take him to the coast, then home. He never saw Major Hendricks again. Danny Reeves returned to Scranton in August 1945. The mine gave him his old job back, blasting foreman, same as before the war. The pay was decent. The work was familiar. The darkness underground felt safe after years of open combat. He didn't talk about the war much. When people asked, he'd say he was a combat engineer, did some demolition work, came home in one piece. That was enough. He never mentioned the mines, never mentioned the farmhouse, never mentioned the 47 men who'd crossed safely because of 3 modified fuses and a good throwing arm. One person knew the whole story. Lieutenant Mackey, who'd become a friend during those training weeks. They exchanged letters for a few years. Mackey wrote about teaching engineering tactics at Fort Belvoir. Danny wrote about coal seams and blasting schedules. The correspondence faded eventually, as these things do. In 1947, Danny married a girl from Wilkes Barre named Catherine. They had 3 kids. He taught them to throw properly, rocks at targets, baseballs at strike zones. Never told them why he cared so much about technique. In 1952, the Army published an updated field manual for combat engineers. Section 7, subsection C, detailed offensive mine deployment techniques. The text was clinical, precise, stripped of personality. It mentioned accuracy requirements, fuse modification procedures, safety protocols. It didn't mention Danny Reeves. He wouldn't have cared anyway. He was too busy raising kids and setting demolition charges and living a quiet life in a Pennsylvania coal town. The technique spread beyond the Army. In 1954, Marine Corps combat engineers adopted a modified version for Pacific operations. In 1958, it was included in NATO training protocols. By 1960, it was standard doctrine for combat engineers in 17 countries. Nobody remembered where it came from. Nobody cared about the coal miner who'd invented it in a foxhole while his friends were dying. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees, not through generals, through corporals who get angry enough to break the rules, through miners who bring civilian skills to military problems, through men who decide that saving lives matters more than following doctrine. Danny Reeves died in 1994 at 71 of lung cancer from 49 years breathing coal dust. His obituary in the Scranton Times mentioned his service in World War II, his work in the mines, his 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. It didn't mention that he'd invented a combat technique that saved hundreds of lives. It didn't mention the farmhouse or the church tower, or the 47 men who crossed the Ruhr safely. It mentioned that he was a good father, a skilled blaster, and a man who kept his promises. That was enough. In 2003, a military historian at West Point was researching World War II combat engineering innovations. He found a report buried in the archives. 3rd Army, 1945. Tactical analysis of mine warfare developments. In an appendix, one paragraph mentioned Corporal Daniel Reeves. The historian tracked down the full story through old after-action reports, training documents, interviews with surviving veterans. He published it in a small military history journal under the title Innovative Tactics in ETO Combat Engineering. 43 people read it. One of them was Danny Reeves's grandson, who'd never known his grandfather had done anything unusual during the war. The old man had just been grandpa, quiet, kind, good at fixing things, gone too soon. The grandson drove to Scranton, visited the cemetery, stood at the simple granite headstone that said, Daniel Reeves, 1923-1994, beloved father and husband. He thought about 47 men crossing a river safely, about 3 perfect throws in the darkness, about rules broken to save lives. He didn't add anything to the headstone. It was fine as it was. Some men change wars quietly. Some innovations spread without fanfare. Some heroes die without recognition. That doesn't make them less important. It just makes them honest. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.